Securing the center immediately, 1d4 opens lines for the queen and bishop, aiming for rapid development and board control. Developing this knight immediately prepares for potential pawn breaks while challenging white's central control. Asserting central influence, this push immediately contests the d5 square and prepares to develop the queen's bishop to its active diagonal. Challenging white's central grip, this pawn thrust immediately aims for dynamic counterplay and an unbalanced position. A bold pawn push, gaining space but creating pawn weaknesses that might become targets later. Opening the diagonal for the queen's bishop and challenging white's central pawn mass with a gambit idea. Securing the central pawn majority, this knight's development prepares to contest further central territory and potentially swing to the kingside. Shattering the central pawn chain immediately injects tactical complications and opens lines for both sides. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately opens central lines and prepares for rapid development, aiming to exploit black's somewhat loose pawn structure. Relinquishing central pressure now opens a diagonal for the bishop and frees the d-pawn for potential advancement. Unleashing the queen immediately grabs central squares, but be mindful of its early exposure. It could become a target for developing minor pieces, forcing an awkward retreat and potentially sacrificing tempo. Reclaiming central presence, the knight's activation on c6 immediately contests white's queen and prepares for future pawn advancements, creating a dynamic pawn structure where black aims to exploit the open files that will inevitably materialize. Developing the kingside knight now offers a dual benefit. It clears the path for the bishop and immediately exerts pressure on black's queen, forcing it to move and potentially disrupting black's setup. Opening the d-file with the pawn allows for potential piece activity and prepares to challenge white's central pawn structure. Aggressively targeting the kingside, this knight leap immediately pressures f7 and prepares potential sacrifices or mating nets. White aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and exploit any lingering weaknesses around the monarch. It's a sharp commitment, demanding precise defense from black to avoid a swift collapse. Bringing the queen centrally allows for both defense of the e6 pawn and potential counterplay along the e-file, while also preparing to castle kingside. Recapturing the pawn with the queen, this action reclaims central space and immediately challenges black's central control, while also preparing for potential kingside attacks by freeing up knights for action. Diverting the looming knight from its aggressive post on g5 creates vital breathing room for black's monarch, simultaneously preparing to challenge white's imposing queen on e4. Exchanging queens now simplifies the position and directly addresses the threat to the white king, aiming for a more comfortable middle game where white can leverage their active knight and control of central squares. Consolidating the bishop's position, this recapture clears the e-file for potential future skirmishes and prepares for the development of the remaining pieces, aiming to activate them efficiently in the center. Re-establishing knight activity, the immediate threat to the e7 bishop is indirect, aiming to provoke further pawn weaknesses or create space for other pieces. Opening up the bishop to its most active diagonal, black seeks to contest the central squares and improve piece coordination, aiming to equalize the position by developing a more flexible structure. Befitting the structure, developing the bishop to control the d6 pawn and prepare for a potential kingside pawn advance showcases white's intent to seize initiative. Aggressively challenging the central knight, this maneuver injects immediate dynamism, aiming to disrupt white's developing harmony and exploit potential pawn weaknesses on the queenside by forcing a knight exchange or a retreat. Securing the king is paramount, and relocating it from the center to a safer file is a wise preventative measure against potential future attacks that could arise from black's developing pieces. Securing the king in the opposite side castling scenario with this move immediately brings the monarch to relative safety, while simultaneously preparing to bring the rooks into play along the open files that will inevitably materialize. Unbalancing the pawn structure, white immediately aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially create a weakness on the queenside. Re-establishing knight pressure on the central squares, Black repositions the knight to a more active role, aiming to disrupt white's bishop's influence and potentially prepare for further pawn advances or piece maneuvering. The knight now eyes the c3 square and participates more directly in the fight for control of the center. A timely repositioning of the pawn allows the king to find a safer harbor, escaping the open diagonal, while simultaneously preparing to activate the light-squared bishop for potential counterplay on the queen side. Unleashing the central pawn offers a dynamic release of tension, forcing white's pieces to reevaluate their comfortable positions. This ambitious advance aims to disrupt white's knights and potentially open lines for black's active pieces, especially the rook on d8, creating immediate tactical questions about knight development and pawn structure. Stepping the knight back to c3 allows white to regroup, aiming to contest the central d5 pawn and potentially reinforce the queen side. This redeployment is a flexible response to black's recent pawn thrust, avoiding an immediate exchange and keeping options open for knight activity on the c-file or even a future b4 push to disturb black's rook. The king, though exposed, is now a step closer to the center, a subtle shift in the endgame balance as the queens have been exchanged. Sacrificing the pawn for a moment allows black to seize control of the open d-file, potentially liberating the pinned bishop and initiating a counterplay against white's potentially exposed king. Securing the monarch's perimeter is paramount as the board simplifies, a prudent retreat to avoid immediate tactical entanglements and maintain structural integrity before the inevitable exchange of pieces escalates. Intending to reinforce the queenside structure and prepare for potential pawn advances, black seeks to establish a more solid foothold. The placement of the pawn on a6, while seemingly passive, aims to prevent white's knight from easily infiltrating onto b5, offering a degree of prophylactic control. This subtle maneuver also conserves tempo, as instead of immediately developing another piece, black shores up a vulnerable area, anticipating white's likely attempts to exploit weaknesses in the pawn chain. Developing the bishop to its natural square, preparing to connect the rooks and bringing the king closer to the center, a vital preparatory step in this complex middle game. Black's bishop now aims to secure the long diagonal, preparing to contest the crucial c-file and potentially disrupt white's central pawn structure if the opportunity arises. Shifting the bishop to f3 aims to solidify the pawn chain and prepare for potential activity on the king side, while also considering a future retreat to g2 if the bishop becomes overly exposed. Initiating a foray into the queen side with the knight, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially challenge the light-squared bishop's influence. Opening the f-file for potential pressure, white initiates a capture that simplifies the position while aiming to exploit black's slightly underdeveloped queenside pieces. Reclaiming the bishop with this capture strategically reestablishes material equality and sets up a more balanced pawn structure for black, while also activating the bishop to a central diagonal. The white king courageously ventures into the center, a bold statement aiming to disrupt black's developing pieces and prepare for an active endgame by contesting crucial central squares and potentially sheltering from any immediate pawn advances that might arise on the queen side. Black solidifies their queenside presence, preparing to expand and contest the open queenside files, while also safeguarding the pawn chain's integrity against potential incursions by white's knight. Focusing on asserting control over the crucial central files, this play immediately contests the open d-file, aiming to disrupt black's developing plans and prepare for a potential pawn storm on the queen side. Seeking refuge and activation for the rook, black's king sidles closer to the center, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially leverage the semi-open c-file. Initiating a crucial file occupation here, white aims to leverage the open d-file and challenge black's control. This maneuver is all about piece coordination, preparing for potential advances and pressuring black's kingside where the monarch, though castled, still has some lingering exposure. Consider how the rook's presence on the d-file restricts black's options and sets the stage for future activity, perhaps even threatening a pawn push or a tactical skirmish. The black king, now conspicuously exposed on b6, becomes a prime target for potential white incursions along the file and c-file as the rooks become activated. demanding careful consideration of defensive positioning and pawn structure reinforcement. Positioning the rook on the c-file aims to challenge black's control and potentially launch a queenside pawn push with the support of the rook. Simplifying the position by exchanging the rook's opens avenues for counterplay on the queenside for black, and a slight advantage for white in terms of space. Focusing on the king's safety, repositioning your monarch to a slightly less exposed square begins to solidify your position as the exchange of queens draws nearer to a pawn-heavy endgame. Unleashing the rook onto the open d-file forces white's king to relocate, potentially disrupting its defensive setup and creating new targets. Initiating the king's relocation from the central battlefield to a safer haven on the queenside is a prudent step, preparing it for the endgame where direct confrontation with black's active pieces could prove perilous. Dynamically seizing the open b-file, this gambit is a clear signal of aggressive intent, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and generate counterplay on the queenside. Pivoting the knight to d1 opens a pathway for the rook on c2 to potentially exploit the open c-file, while simultaneously offering defensive support to the d3 pawn should it become vulnerable later. Capturing the pawn opens a vital diagonal for the white bishop and unfortunately opens up the c-file for potential pressure, complicating the defensive structure around your king. Opening the b-file dramatically shifts the initiative, creating immediate threats against black's rather exposed king. The rook on d3 now exerts immediate pressure along the third rank, challenging white's pawn structure and eyeing the potential for disruption. The knight's repositioning to the b2 square, a seemingly passive retreat, cleverly unblocks the a-pawn and prepares a decisive pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious piece development and exploit the open lines that have emerged on the queenside. Unbalancing the pawn structure, black immediately leverages the open diagonal to harass the white king and disrupt white's coordination, forcing a concession. Seizing the open file with the rook, a decisive initiative is claimed, leveraging the king's exposed position and the lingering weakness on white's dark squares. The king ventures boldly into enemy territory, seeking respite and activity on the queenside wing amidst the scattered pawns. Securing the advanced rook on a desirable open file after black's queen activity is a sound strategic choice, aiming to consolidate positional gains and prepare for potential king's side expansion. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's reorganized pieces and potentially open a path for the rook on the now exposed a file, creating immediate questions about the safety of the white king tucked away. Probing the weakened dark squares around black's king, this bishop repositions to eye the c3 square and potentially support a kingside advance later, while also adding pressure to the now isolated a3 pawn. Sacrificing the bishop for the rook dramatically alters the endgame dynamics, creating an immediate threat on the queenside and forcing white into a defensive posture. Seizing the open file is paramount, and consolidating the pawn structure after the capture becomes the immediate strategic imperative. The bishop, having escaped its prior confinement, now seeks to disrupt white's newly established rook presence on the file by targeting the pawn chain's weakest link. Securing the d-pawn's advance to f4 suddenly ignites the kingside, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's castled monarch and potentially create a passed pawn of its own. A daring thrust, aiming to seize control of the open files and unravel white's pawn structure, but it leaves the black king exposed to potential threats along the dark squares. The bishop's repositioning here aims to solidify control over the dark squares and prepare for a potential pawn push on the kingside, even as it temporarily retreats from the central fray. The black king bravely ventures into the enemy camp, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay on the queenside. This audacious maneuver could either lead to decisive advantage or a swift, unfortunate end. Finally, the bishop is repositioned to a square where it actively defends the knight and eyes the potential pawn push on the kingside. Snatching that pawn, black boldly disrupts white's pawn structure, creating a passed c-pawn, but this aggressive grab exposes the monarch to a significant degree. Capturing the pawn on f7 sacrifices material for open lines towards black's exposed king, a bold initiative to disrupt the opponent's coordination and seize the initiative in this unbalanced position. The black king, having ventured deep into enemy territory and achieved a seemingly advantageous pawn acquisition, now finds itself in a precarious position, surrounded by white's coordinated pieces. Seizing the central pawn advances the e-pawn's march, aiming to create a passed threat and potentially open lines for the king's safety as the queens are off the board. The pawn push forward aims to create a passed pawn on the c-file, a dangerous prospect for white who is currently struggling with piece coordination and king safety. This aggressive advance forces white to confront the potential of a queen escorting its new ally to promotion. The pawn's relentless advance across the board now begins to create a decisive spatial advantage, pushing black's king further into its own territory while simultaneously opening pathways for white's remaining pieces. Pushing the pawn forward now aims to create a passed pawn on the queen side, a crucial endgame advantage, while simultaneously attempting to block white's bishop from its potentially active squares. Chasing the black king across the board has led to a fascinating, if somewhat chaotic, material imbalance, and this rook sacrifice aims to exploit that by creating a passed pawn. The pawn push aims to create a passed threat on the file, forcing the white king into a more exposed position. Embrace the open diagonal for your bishop, aiming to harass that advanced pawn and potentially trap the black king on the queen side. The passed pawn's relentless march towards promotion now gains unstoppable momentum, threatening to seize control of the crucial queenside squares and unravel white's entire defensive structure. Reclaiming the pawn on c2 immediately tightens white's grip, transforming the open c-file into a potential avenue of attack while simultaneously shoring up the structure against further pawn incursions. The pawn on a3 faces a crucial decision, deciding whether to advance and become a dangerous passed threat or to fortify its position. The white king's sidestep to b2 offers a crucial escape from the immediate pawn threat, preparing to regroup and defend the remaining material. Unleashing a final desperate pawn thrust, black throws a desperate gambit, hoping the passed c-pawn can still wreak havoc.